Oh, hello, Anna Banana.
That's a new one. I mean, not a new one, but at least from you, that's a new one. Hi, Shay.
Hi. Yeah, I'm feeling a little loopy. I'm coming off of a few hours of intense rubric creation. So,
Yikes. Yeah, rubric creation is such a critical piece of assessment, but it can take a lot out of you.
indeed. So, listeners, last month we released an episode on assessment, and we were trying to avoid talking about rubrics because we just knew that rubrics were deserving of their own episode, maybe even more than one.
That's right. I mean, I know that whenever I think of assessment, my mind automatically brings me to rubrics. We need rubrics to make assessments fair and accurate.
I agree. But for our listeners who might not agree, why do we need rubrics?
Let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shay. So, Anna, before we get into the importance of using rubrics for assessment, I want to point out that we might have listeners wondering what we mean. What exactly are rubrics?
Well, simply put, a rubric is just an explicit set of criteria used for assessing performance on a task. And the key word there is explicit. The criteria can't just be in your head, right?
Totally. A lot of times teachers have in their minds this idea of what they want, the desired outcome, but they don't actually express those expectations to students. So there is a need to do that, right? And that's just one reason to have a rubric.
Absolutely. There are a lot of reasons to use rubrics, but I think the really basic concept is we want to be objective in scoring something. With assessment that's more subjective, that doesn't have a single correct set of answers, if we don't have a rubric, we're just going to score it however we want to based on what our mood is that day.
Yikes, which is a pretty dangerous way to go about assessment, I think, all willy-nilly.
Yeah, and actually, Shay, I have a question for you.
Oh gosh, here we go again.
Another assessment question for you. If we have, a bunch of different assessments, which of these assessments is going to end up being the most objective? Is it A, a series of multiple choice questions, B, a gap fill vocabulary task, C, short responses to open-ended reading comprehension questions, or D, an essay assignment? Which one is most objective?
So before I answer, I want to point out for our listeners, we have a page of notes that we use as we talk through our conversations to prepare for episode recordings. And I want to just highlight for the audience that Anna has highlighted the correct answer for me. So I don't know, maybe she's doubting my ability to get the answer right.
No, Shay, that was imported from a workshop I did, I promise.
I kid. But yeah, as far as objectivity is concerned, having multiple choice questions is going to be the most objective scoring. So my answer is option A, multiple choice questions.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an established set of wrong or right answers. With these more objective types of assessment, anyone could score multiple choice questions with an answer key, right?
Yes.
They don't need any particular skill. That's why we often, at least in the States, just put multiple choice tests through a Scantron and are done, right? Or actually, I don't actually know if we use Scantrons anymore, honestly.
We may be dating ourselves here. I don't know.
Yeah, but the point is it's mechanical. There's no kind of judgment required.
Right, but looking at the other examples, an essay, short answers, or even a gap fill, really any time that students are producing their own language, there are shades of meaning that we're going to have to consider when we're looking at their responses. It involves some kind of judgment call, right? Some kind of skill or training.
Right? You wouldn't just have a random person score an essay,
Yeah, like, hey, Mom, can you help me grade these essays?
Right. And listeners might be wondering, well, Having students respond to open-ended questions is really necessary for assessing student knowledge. And that's a fair point and not something we're trying to dissuade anyone from doing. But it's really necessary that we recognize the difference between forms of assessment that lend themselves to objectivity and those that don't.
Yes, and teachers can fall prey to moments of extreme subjectivity when they're not equipping themselves with tools to be objective.
Rubrics.
Yes, asking yourself whether an essay is well written is on par with asking if chocolate is a good flavor.
So subjective.
Yeah, we really have to define what good or well written looks like.
I mean, is chocolate a good flavor, Shay?
I mean, personally, I love chocolate.
Yum. I'd eat chocolate any day. But yeah, I mean, whether or not we like chocolate is subjective. Whether or not we think an essay is good, quote unquote, is subjective. And while we can never remove subjectivity entirely, rubrics can help with that. So, we use a rubric to create clear expectations for students and so that we can grade students more fairly and equally.
And when we say fairly and equally, we know that even though we pretend we don't, we all have favorite students. So rubrics are a tool for us to assess without drawing from implicit biases that we might have about a student's abilities, and to make sure that feelings that we might be harboring about a certain individual don't impact how the student is being assessed in our class. So rubrics, I see them as sort of a protection for us and our students.
Absolutely. And not to mention, I mean, I don't know if you've ever had a student come up to you after class and be like, this is not the right grade. And you're like, well, actually look at the rubric. This is where you can point to the specifics.
Yeah. Having a rubric can really help you defend your decisions if or when, more likely, students are complaining about their grades. And I am speaking from experience here. Students do check in with their friends and compare notes on how they're being assessed. And then they might call you out on your decisions. And so as teachers, and this is another way rubrics can be useful, we're not comparing performance between one student and another.
Yeah, what you're describing is a norm referenced assessment. That's where you have a scale and teachers score based on the performance of the group, not of each individual independently. Like a curve, they're basing the score on how other people did. So that's norm referenced. And there's also criterion referenced.
Yeah, so norm referenced makes comparisons between individuals, and criterion reference test look at an individual's performance compared to a specific set of standards or criteria and norms.
To be honest, I'm not a fan of norm reference tests because they don't really tell you what the actual skills are. Often a teacher will say, I'm going to grade this on a curve because so many people did horribly. And then it boosts a couple of people's scores, but not others.
I don't love bell curves either. And I think that as a teacher, if we're having to resort to bell curving often, we might want to examine our instruction.
Oh my gosh, we are such hard asses. I'd be interested in hearing what listeners have to say about this.
Yeah, so we may come across as rough around the edges, but as we mentioned in our episode on assessment,
episode 31,
how students perform on assessment is just as much about how we're delivering instruction as it is about student performance. If done well, rubrics or other tools can aid us in being more objective and ensure that we're reliably assessing student performance.
Yeah, reliably. You're bringing up this question of rater reliability. So the teacher is the rater, and if you have more than one teacher or you're using the same assessment across course sections and different teachers are grading them, there's inter-rater reliability. Inter meaning between two different people. So two different teachers will grade more similarly when using a rubric. And you really need that if you're going to do any kind of comparison across student groups or class groups. And then there's intra-rater reliability, which is what we've been talking about primarily, is one teacher grading consistently according to students' actual performance.
I remember when you revamped the English language placement test at Fordham, you set up what I found to be really enlightening norming sessions.
Yeah.
And we all sat together and examined the rubric for an argumentative essay that was part of the placement process at the university. And we'd examine different sample essays and rate them using a rubric. And sometimes there'd be discrepancies. And we'd share out why we thought the student deserved the score we gave them using language specifically from the rubric.
Yeah, that norming is essential. You know, I think many teachers have had the experience of just having some kind of like side gig as raters for a larger test. And so they might be familiar with norming through like some kind of online training system where if the scores they give are not aligned closely enough with what the benchmark scores are for those samples, they're not allowed to be a rater like, at all. So this inter-rater reliability is really big.
Yeah, and to replicate that on the classroom level, like if you're adopting some kind of shared assessment across, let's say you have different sections of the same course, communicate with your colleagues. Maybe do a little norming session together.
Totally. So Shay, now that we've established the need to use rubrics, perhaps we should get into the characteristics of a rubric.
Absolutely. The specificity of a rubric really depends on what we are measuring, and I'm a huge proponent of being as specific as possible, as explicit as possible. But there is sort of a sweet spot.
Yes. I mean, if it's not specific enough, we're going to get a poor rate of reliability and more subjectivity. So for example, if we're grading a presentation, I've done this in moments I've been rushed and it's horrible, but I'll be like, you can get 3 points for content, 3 points for pronunciation, 3 points for fluency.
And so what do 1, 2, and 3 even mean?
Yeah, we really have to try to define what each of those levels actually means with explicit wording. And it doesn't have to be like 5 sentences. It can be just one clear sentence of what each of those levels means.
But it could also be too specific, right?
Yeah, it's easy to get carried away. Or for a short essay, I don't know, if students spelled, 10 to 12 words incorrectly, they lose a certain amount of points. I mean, but in building a rubric like this, are we really going to count the number of words on every submission for an essay? I mean, who has time for that?
Oh, no. Be good to yourselves, friends. Be wiser with your time, please.
Yeah. And then, there's a question of also what happens if one student wrote 3 paragraphs and made, several spelling mistakes, but then another wrote just 1 paragraph with fewer mistakes. That kind of specificity in a rubric can sort of screw you and your students over.
Right. So different kinds of rubrics facilitate different levels of specificity.
Yeah, maybe counting spelling mistakes makes sense on a spelling test.
Sure.
But for an essay, there has to be a better way of wording it so that we're not creating more problems for ourselves.
And the level of specificity also depends on what kind of rubric we're creating.
Right. The 4 primary types of rubrics. First, we have holistic rubrics versus primary trait rubrics. These are somewhat simpler rubrics. There's a single scale, like from 1 to 5 or something, and each number has a descriptor associated with it, like the writing is clear and well crafted, and the student shows a solid understanding of the material or whatnot. The student's score consists of that one number. But the difference here is a holistic rubric evaluates the student's many skills in general. You can often use these for different kinds of tasks, while a primary trait rubric evaluates one specific skill and is generally tied to a specific task. So like just fluency, just teamwork, just organization.
And for holistic and primary trait, we might even use more of a checklist type of thing, right?
Right, they're simpler. But then we have analytic versus multi-trait rubrics. An analytic rubric is similar to a holistic rubric in that it focuses on general information on learner performance. And so these are really useful to use over and over again. If you're not looking for anything specific, you're just looking at general proficiency. But the difference is there are multiple categories, not just one scale. So you'll have a separate number for like content, organization, and grammar. Multi-trait or multiple trait rubrics, on the other hand, they also use multiple scales, but they address more specific traits related to the task. For example, like in a course that I did on social media marketing, I had some more general information about just, like their command of English. But then in terms of content, I was very specific. Like this includes a rationale, which explains XYZ reasons for decisions they made in the social media campaign. So it's more specific than analytic.
And that's where you might spend a little more time creating the rubric before you assign that task, right?
Right. And you're not just creating these rubrics and using them to just assess. You're also, using these rubrics to tell students what's expected of them. And so in that, we should note it's important to use positive language to encourage them in the learning process.
So instead of presenting these different characteristics of student work as a deficit, like the student fails too, right? We really need to be cognizant of the impact our language has and promote a can-do attitude.
They aren't called the can-do descriptors for nothing.
That's right. So, Anna, we've listed several reasons to use rubrics, but some of our listeners might be thinking, rubric creation takes so long.
Yeah, but I mean, we're either going to end up spending hours and hours providing individual commentary on student assignments, or spend our time up front making the rubric, choosing really specific language for our descriptors so that students feel like we're giving that really specific feedback. Because then you can sort of just plug it in.
Yeah. The student can easily determine where they fall on the rubric based on descriptors we've selected. And from there, we might decide to write a little bit of commentary.
Yeah, I mean, even with the rubric, at least I'm always trying to make more value for the students in the feedback with some extra commentary. But still, the rubric expedites grading for sure.
True. I think it can feel sort of sterile and impersonal to receive a rubric and no commentary at all, even if you're helping yourself rationalize the grade. But if we have the bandwidth, we should still consider giving some added value in the form of a comment.
Yeah. I'm always thinking of essays because I know you and I have both taught writing extensively, but also presentations, right? I love grading presentations, but they're extremely hard because they're elusive, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't have a rubric for that, you're just going to sort of write whatever you want. It's really important to be able, while you're listening, to just circle something, circle a descriptor, maybe add a comment like, oh, try this next time. But having that rubric can really at least lock you into being more efficient and get us to focus on what's important as well.
Right. And maybe we've made it sound really complicated because it is both, I think, an art and a science to create rubrics. But it doesn't have to be complicated. Like anything else we do in teaching, like lesson planning, reflection, or anything we do, it's just another skill. So once we get the hang of rubric design, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Right. So essentially we create one rubric and then we have a template. It becomes so much easier to then build new rubrics. Like I have a set of rubrics that I use and adapt on various occasions depending on what I'm trying to measure and evaluate. But yeah, once you use a lot of the descriptors for different levels, you get used to the words and how to set up a rubric, and it's just like you could use it forever.
Not that we're encouraging anyone to use the same rubrics forever. I have revisited some of my rubrics from a decade ago, and I've been like, time for a revamp. But that's part of growth. We can also take those foundational assessment tools and tweak them to make them more effective. Dare I say, even more engaging for the students.
Engaging, yes. I think a lot of times teachers say, like, here's the rubric, but don't spend time going over the rubric with students, or students don't even look at the rubric. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced that. They're like, there was a rubric?
Oh, for sure. And it's like, are you kidding me, guys? So I think part of that's on us, making sure that we're creating that culture of formative assessment in the classroom and getting them to think about the learning process, getting them to see that rubrics and assessment are tools in the learning process.
Yeah, I think that's great in an ideal scenario, but I have found it really hard to integrate them, take the time to go over the rubric. It's really hard to be intentional about that. And I'll be honest, sometimes I'm just like, I don't have time to do this.
Sure.
We're just going to attach the rubric to the essay and we're done. But I mean, it really adds a lot of value when we can do more than that.
Yeah. And of course, all of this depends on the proficiency and the autonomy level of your learners. You can have a brief conversation with them and have them look at the rubric critically and think about what it means. Have them notice, at the bare minimum, the different language to describe different ratings. things. What does a 4 in this area look like? A 5? How do they differ? With students at higher proficiency, of course, this is easier. But like everything else, I think it comes down to establishing a routine in making something like this accessible once, and then re-emphasizing the importance. Just cultivating awareness goes a long way.
And you can also have them involved in the rubric creation process. I know that's something you've done a lot, Shay.
Yeah, it can be as simple as asking them, what would successful completion of this task look like? Let's imagine what that looks like together. And then my students and I come up with descriptors that describe that vision of a successful product. And because they're involved in the building process, we're augmenting their buy-in, increasing their interest and motivation. We're also making it very clear what's expected of them, and essentially training them to sort of keep that rubric or checklist in their back pocket to use as a tool as they're completing the assignment.
Yeah, rubrics are tools for students and teachers. So teachers, we want to hear from you. What's your experience with using rubrics? What kinds of rubrics do you gravitate to?
What's your longest living rubric?
Long live the rubric! And also, do you have any tips for teachers looking to use them more often or integrate them for the first time?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
And also, as a reminder, we're still gathering listener contributions for our Friends of the Podcast episode, where we will integrate lots of different voices of our listeners from around the world.
If you haven't already, check out the questions we posted on social media. You can contribute your answers by joining our Friends of the Podcast WhatsApp chat at bit.ly/pod_friends. We want to know who you are, where you are, what you do, your strengths and challenges, and something unique about your teaching context.
If WhatsApp isn't for you, you can also email us at teacherthinkaloud@gmail.com or write to us on social media. We're so eager to learn about you, members of this community of practice.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.